Every April the Cedar River flooded. It had flooded every April since before there were farms in Bremer County, Iowa, since before there were counties, since before there were Europeans on this continent. The river swelled with snowmelt, and spring rain climbed its banks, spread across the bottomland, sat there for a week or two, and retreated. It left behind 6 inches to 2 feet of mud. Dark, heavy, fine-grained silt that caked on everything it touched and took weeks to dry. The farmers of the Cedar River bottomland had been dealing with this flood for 100 years. Their grandfathers had dealt with it. Their great-grandfathers had dealt with it. The strategy was always the same. Wait for the water to recede. Wait for the mud to dry. Scrape and plow the field back into shape. Plant late. Hope the shortened season produced enough to cover the losses. Nobody liked the flood. Nobody liked the mud. The mud was the enemy. It buried crops, clogged equipment, delayed planting by 3 to 4 weeks, and left a hard crust on the surface that had to be broken before anything could grow. Every spring, the bottomland farmers lost time and seed and money and gained nothing except a mess. At the co-op in Waverly, the county seat 12 miles downstream, the bottomland farmers were the subject of annual sympathy. Bottoms are flooded again. How bad 18 inches, maybe 2 feet in the low spots. Corbett Dren's West 40 is underwater again. Corbett needs to give up on that ground. You cannot farm a riverbed. The man who said you cannot farm a riverbed was Weston Grawl, the John Deere dealer in Waverly. Weston was 51 years old, sold equipment, and had opinions about every acre in the county. His boots were always clean. His truck was always new. He had never once in his life stood at the edge of a field and had to decide whether to keep farming ground that tried to drown him every spring. He had the particular confidence of a man whose livelihood did not depend on any single decision about any single piece of ground. His opinion about the Cedar River bottomland was delivered the same way every year from the same spot near the coffee machine at the co-op with the same certainty. You cannot control a river. The upland ground is where the money is. Farm the hills. Forget the bottoms. Most of the bottomland farmers agreed with Weston. Not because he was right about the hills, but because they were tired of fighting the river. Several had already abandoned their bottomland fields, shifting production to higher ground, and letting the floodplain go fallow. By 1973, nearly 40% of the farmable bottomland in the western part of the county was unused, too flood-prone to justify the investment. Harlan Foss had abandoned his bottomland 2 years earlier. He had walked away from 40 acres of ground that flooded every spring and had not looked back. He told anyone who would listen that it was the smartest decision he had ever made. Corbett Dren had not abandoned his bottomland. He could not. It was the only land he had. Let me tell you about Corbett Dren, because you need to understand what kind of man sees something in mud that everyone else is shoveling into the ditch. Corbett was 47 years old in the spring of 1973 and had farmed 120 acres in the western part of Bremer County since 1965, when his father died and left him the ground. 80 acres were upland decent soil. Average yields, nothing that would make a man rich, but nothing that would ruin him either. 40 acres were bottomland, the West 40 that everyone at the co-op talked about every April, the field that flooded every year without fail. The ground that Weston Grawl called a waste of time. Corbett had a wife named Norma, who was 45 and had married him in 1953, knowing exactly what she was getting into, and had spent 20 years demonstrating that her judgment about her own life was sound. He had a son named Ned, who was in his early 20s and working the farm alongside his father. He had a farmhouse that needed a new roof, a Farmall tractor that needed new rings, and a bank loan that needed to be serviced from whatever the land produced. He did not have the option of walking away from the West 40. On the morning of April 14th, 1973, Corbett drove his truck to the West 40 after the Cedar River had crested and begun to recede. The water was still ankle-deep in the low spots, brown and slow-moving, carrying the fine silt that it always carried when it slowed down and dropped its load. He parked the truck on the high edge of the field and walked out into the receding flood. The mud came up over the tops of his boots in the deeper spots. It had the weight and consistency of wet concrete, heavy and sticky and cold from the river water that had deposited it. He walked to the center of the field and stopped. All around him the mud stretched to the field boundaries. 6 inches to a foot of it, covering the ground he had plowed last fall, covering the stubble of the wheat crop he had harvested the previous summer. The neighboring farmers were already out in their own flooded fields with tractors and blades scraping the mud toward the ditches, pushing it off their fields and back toward the river as fast as they could work. The goal was always the same: get rid of the mud, get back to the soil underneath, get the field dry enough to plant. Corbett stood in the center of his West 40 and did something that no other farmer in Bremer County was doing that morning. He reached down and picked up a handful of the mud. He held it in both hands and looked at it. It was dark, almost black, the kind of dark that tells you something about what is inside, not the reddish-brown clay of the upland fields, not the pale gray silt you sometimes found in the road ditches after a heavy rain. This mud was nearly black smooth between the fingers, dense in a way that felt different from ordinary soil. He brought it close and smelled it. The smell hit him before he could prepare for it. Rich, deep, organic, the smell of decomposed plant material and living soil and the accumulated fertility of a watershed stretching hundreds of miles upstream. It was the smell of something alive in a way that the upland ground farmed year after year with the same tired rotation no longer smelled. He stood there with that mud in his hands for a long time. Every farmer in Bremer County was shoveling this mud into the ditch. Corbett Dren was the only one who knelt down and smelled it first. He was thinking about his father. August Dren had died in 1965, which meant Corbett had been farming the West 40 without him for 8 years. August had been a quiet man, quieter than most farmers, which is saying something. He had not complained about the flood. He had not cursed the river. He had not attended the meetings where the bottomland farmers petitioned the county for drainage improvements and levee construction. He had just farmed, flooded, farmed again, and kept a notebook. The notebook was a composition book, black and white cover, ruled pages, the kind sold at the 5 and dime for a nickel. August had started it in 1932, the year after he bought the farm. Every April after the flood, he had recorded 4 things: the date the water arrived, the date it receded, the maximum depth on the West 40, and the color and texture of the mud it left behind. 42 years of entries, 42 floods. The notebook was nearly full when August died. Corbett had found it in the desk in the barn office, not hidden, just filed among seed receipts and equipment manuals like any other farm record. He had read it once after his father died, understood that it was a record of the floods, and put it back in the desk drawer. He had not thought about it much since. It had not seemed like anything more than an old man's habit of writing things down. But standing in the West 40 that April morning with a handful of black mud in his hands, Corbett was thinking about something his father had said to him when he was a boy. Something August had said every spring without explaining what he meant by it. The river takes, but the river gives. August had said it the way a man says something he has thought about for a long time and reduced to its simplest form. Not as a consolation and not as a complaint. As a fact. A statement of something he had observed and considered and arrived at after 40 years of watching the same river do the same thing to the same field every spring. Corbett had not understood it as a boy. He had not understood it as a young man taking over the farm. He had accepted it as one of those things fathers say that contain more than they appear to contain, and he had filed it somewhere in the back of his mind where such things wait until the moment arrives when they are needed. Standing in the West 40 in April of 1973 with mud in his hands and the smell of something extraordinarily alive in his nose, Corbett Dren understood his father's saying for the first time. He drove home and went to the barn office. He found the composition book in the desk drawer where he had put it 8 years earlier. He sat at the desk and read it again, this time more carefully, this time looking for what his father had actually been recording. The flood depth varied from 6 inches in dry years to 32 inches in the big one of 1951, but the average over 42 years was 17 inches. The flood duration averaged 11 days. And the mud. August had described the mud every year with the same careful attention a doctor gives a patient's symptoms. April 1938. Mud dark, heavy, smells rich. 2 thumbs thick on fence rails. April 1947. Mud lighter than usual, sandy, less smell, thin layer. April 1953. Mud very dark, deepest deposit in years, stands on boots like paint. August had been grading the mud without knowing the science behind it. The dark, heavy, strong-smelling deposits were high in organic matter years when the river had picked up more decomposed material from upstream. The lighter, sandier deposits were lower quality years when the water moved fast and dropped its coarse material early. His father had been reading the river's deposits the way a farmer reads soil by color and texture and smell, and recording the results in a 5-cent composition book for 42 years. Corbett sat with that notebook for a long time. Then he drove to Waverly and made a phone call to the Iowa State University Extension Service. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon in early May, Corbett drove to the extension office and picked up the results of the soil analysis he had requested. He had sent 3 samples of the flood mud from different locations on the West 40. The results were printed on a single sheet of paper, with the Iowa State Extension Service header at the top and a note at the bottom from the technician who had processed the samples. He read the numbers in the parking lot before he drove anywhere. Organic matter, 7.2%. He knew the county average for upland fields was around 3.8. His flood mud had nearly double the organic matter of normal Iowa farmland. Nitrogen, 142 pounds per acre available. The upland average was about 80. The flood mud had 78% more nitrogen than the field's Weston Grawl sold equipment to farm. Phosphorus, 61 parts per million. Upland average 29, more than double. Potassium, 218 parts per million. Upland average 145, 50% higher. and at the bottom of the sheet, in the handwriting of the technician who had run the analysis, a note that Corbett read 3 times. Excellent alluvial deposit comparable to prime river delta soils. He sat in the parking lot for a while with that piece of paper in his hands, then he drove to the co-op. It was a Saturday morning, which meant the co-op was full. The farmers gathered on Saturday mornings the way they had always gathered for coffee and conversation, and the particular kind of information exchange that happens when men who work the same land in the same county stand in the same room and talk. Weston Grawl was there near the coffee machine in his clean boots, with the particular posture of a man who considers himself well placed to observe everything. Corbett walked to the bulletin board without saying anything to anyone. He pinned the soil report to the board with a single thumbtack centered at eye level. He stepped back and went to pour himself a cup of coffee. The conversations continued around him. Then someone standing near the board went quiet. Then someone else. The way a room goes quiet when something on a bulletin board demands to be read. Weston Grawl walked over to the board and read the report. He stood there for a moment. Then he reached up and took the report down from the board. He looked at Corbett across the room. Corbett looked back at him and did not say anything. Weston folded the paper and dropped it in the trash can beside the bulletin board and walked back to the coffee machine. Corbett had seen him do it. He had been watching. He had been watching from the moment he pinned the report to the board, and he had watched Weston read it and take it down and throw it away. And he had felt something clarify inside him, the way things clarify when someone shows you exactly who they are. He finished his coffee and left. The following Saturday, Corbett stood up at the co-op and told anyone who would listen what he planned to do with his West 40. He explained it plainly, without drama and without asking for anyone's opinion. He was going to build raised beds from the flood mud, 3 feet high, 20 feet wide, 100 feet long. He was going to pile the mud into mounds using his farm awl, and a blade shape them, let them dry and settle, and plant vegetables on top. He had 12 beds planned. He had done the arithmetic on the height based on his father's flood records. 3 feet put the bed surface 4 inches above the worst flood in 42 years of observation. The co-op went quiet for about 2 seconds. Then Weston Grawl started laughing. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who is so certain of something that the alternative strikes him as genuinely funny, the way a joke is funny because the premise is so obviously impossible. He shared the laugh with the room, turning slightly to include everyone in his assessment. "He is going to build sand castles and plant tomatoes on river garbage," Weston said. "Somebody get this man a bucket and a plastic shovel." The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Harlan Foss laughed, the man who had walked away from his own bottomland 2 years earlier and had been waiting for someone to confirm that he had been right to do so. A few others who had no particular opinion about bottomland farming laughed because Weston had laughed, and Weston was the kind of man whose laughter other men joined without always examining why. Corbett stood and listened to it. He did not smile and he did not argue. When Weston finished, he looked at him directly. "It is alluvial silt," Corbett said. "Take a sample to the extension office and test it. The results will tell you what it is." "I am not testing mud," Weston said. "I am selling tractors." "Then do not test it," Corbett said. "I have already tested it. When the results are back, I will be building beds while you are still laughing." He walked out. That night, at the kitchen table after supper, after Ned had gone to his room and the dishes were done and the house was quiet, Norma sat across from Corbett with her coffee and looked at her husband. She had been married to him for 20 years. She knew the difference between the things he said because he was frustrated and the things he said because he had decided. She had watched him at the co-op that morning, had seen his face when Weston laughed, had watched him leave without changing expression. She put her hand over his hand on the table. "Corbett," she said, "what if they are right? What if it does not work?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the composition book that was sitting on the corner of the table, the one he had brought in from the barn office 3 weeks ago, and had been reading at the kitchen table most evenings since. He looked at his father's handwriting on the cover, the careful block letters that August had always used. The ones that said this was a man who did not write quickly because he did not think quickly, who thought slowly and carefully and then wrote down what he had arrived at. "My father watched that river for 42 years, Corbett said. He recorded every flood, every depth, every description of the mud it left behind. He kept those numbers in that book for 42 years, and he told me the river gives. I owe him the chance to find out if he was right." Norma looked at him. She looked at the book. She did not say anything else. She stood up and refilled his coffee cup and set it back down in front of him and went to check that the back door was locked before bed. That was the end of the discussion about weather. The discussion about how had been going on in Corbett's head since the morning he stood in the West 40 with mud in his hands. By the time he started work in the first week of May, the how was settled. He started with the height. 42 years of August flood records showed that the average flood on the West 40 reached 17 inches. The deepest flood on record, the one in 1951 that August had described as the worst in his memory, had reached 32 inches. 3 feet put the bed surface 36 inches above the normal ground level, which was 4 inches above the worst flood August had ever recorded. If the Cedar River ever exceeded 32 inches on the West 40, the beds would go under. But in 42 years of careful observation, it never had. The 3 feet was not a round number chosen for convenience. It was a calculation. It was his father's 42 years of watching translated into a measurement that Corbett could push into shape with a tractor blade. He drove his farmall to the West 40 on a morning in early May when the mud had dried enough to support the tractor's weight without sinking. The alluvial silt, when freshly deposited, was like wet concrete, heavy, sticky, impossible to work. But after 2 weeks of sun and wind, it dried to a firm consistency that held its shape when pushed into a pile. He used the rear-mounted blade to push the flood mud into long, parallel mounds 3 feet high at the center, sloping gently to the edges 20 feet wide, 100 feet long. He built 12 beds on the West 40, arranged in rows with 8-foot gaps between them. The gaps were not wasted space. They were drainage channels. When the river flooded, the water would flow through the gaps and around the beds, depositing more silt in the channels, which Corbett would shovel onto the beds after the water receded. The bed tops 3 feet above the normal flood level would stay dry. The construction took 2 weeks. Corbett worked alone most days. The old farmall pushing the heavy silt, slowly smoke curling from the exhaust stack. The tractor straining in low gear through material that weighed more than ordinary soil and moved with more resistance. Each bed required approximately 12 tractor loads of material. 144 loads total for 12 beds. His neighbors drove past and watched from the road. Harlan Foss stopped one afternoon. He parked on the road and got out and looked at the rough brown mounds taking shape across the West 40. They were lumpy and uneven, still wet in some places, steaming faintly in the May warmth, where the dark surface absorbed heat faster than the surrounding ground. "What are you building?" Corbett Harlan asked. "Raised beds," Corbett said. "For vegetables. Out of flood mud. Out of alluvial silt," Corbett said. "The best soil in the county." Harlan looked at the mounds. They did look like something. He searched for the right description and arrived at the one that seemed most accurate. "They look like graves for giants," Harlan said. "They will look like a garden by August," Corbett said. Harlan shook his head slowly. He looked at the West 40 the way a man looks at a field he has already made his peace about. He had walked away from his own bottomland 2 years earlier. He had made that decision and closed the door on it. Watching Corbett build raised beds in the mud seemed to him like a man trying to open a door that Harlan had already understood was locked. He got back in his truck and drove on. The second week of construction brought weather that Corbett had not planned for, which is the nature of weather in Iowa in May. A cold front moved through on a Tuesday and brought 2 days of steady rain, not heavy but persistent, the kind of rain that does not flood anything but does not allow anything to dry either. The mud that Corbett had pushed into his bed shapes was still wet enough in the lower sections that the added moisture was too much. On the morning of the second day of rain, Corbett drove down to the West 40 and found that one of the beds had slumped on one side. Not collapsed, not ruined, but visibly settled and deformed on the south face, a slow slide of material back toward the channel below it. He sat in the truck and looked at it. Weston Grawl's truck came down the county road while Corbett was sitting there. Weston slowed when he reached the West 40, the way he had been slowing every time he passed since construction started. He stopped on the road and looked at the slumped bed. He looked at the rain on the windshield. He looked at Corbett sitting in his truck at the field edge. He did not get out. He did not say anything. He put the truck back in gear and drove on. That silence was heavier than anything Weston had said at the co-op. A man who laughs at something believes it is worth laughing at. A man who drives past in silence without even the satisfaction of telling you he told you so has moved past contempt into something that has no name but that a farmer sitting in a truck in the rain knows in his body. Corbett sat there for 20 minutes. He was not thinking about Weston Grawle. That would have been too easy to frame his uncertainty around the opinion of a man whose boots were always clean. What Corbett was thinking about was his father. He was thinking about the possibility that August had watched the river for 42 years and had arrived at a beautiful sounding saying that was not actually true. That the river takes and the river takes and the river takes, and what it gives is mud that slides back into the channel when the rain comes. He was thinking about the composition book and the 42 years of careful entries, the dark mud and the light mud, the rich deposits and the thin ones, all that patient observation, amounting to a record that Corbett had staked his spring on, and the possibility that his father had simply been wrong. He sat with that possibility for a long time. Then he opened the truck door and stepped out into the rain. He walked to the slumped bed and looked at it from every angle. The slide had happened on the south face because that face had been built from mud that was still too wet when the rain came. The north face of the same bed, built from material that had dried a few days more, was holding its shape. The slide was not a failure of the design. It was a failure of timing, of building with material that was not yet ready for the weight and angle it was being asked to hold. He went back to the truck and got his tools. He worked alone in the rain from 4 in the afternoon until after 9 at night, rebuilding the slumped face of the bed, piling drier material from the field margins against the wet core shaping and tamping it by hand where the tractor blade could not work precisely enough. He worked in the dark for the last hour with the truck lights aimed at the bed, the rain still falling, his hands cold and his back hurting from bending and lifting in the clay mud. Norma was in the kitchen when he came in. She had seen the truck lights in the field from the kitchen window. She had watched them stay there through the dinner hour and into the evening, moving occasionally stationary for long periods, and she had understood what her husband was doing out there alone in the rain in the dark. She had not gone out. She had left the light above the stove on and kept the coffee warm on a low burner, and when Corbett came through the back door at almost 10 o'clock, covered in mud from his boots to his elbows, the coffee was still hot. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink and poured himself a cup and stood at the counter drinking it. Norma did not say anything about the slumped bed or the rain or the hours in the dark. There are things between a man and woman who have been married 20 years that do not need to be said because they have already been established in the accumulated weight of all the things that have been said before. She had asked him what if they are right. He had told her about his father and the 42 years. She had poured his coffee and gone to check the back door. That was the agreement. The question had been asked and answered, and the coffee had been poured, and everything after that was execution. He finished the cup and went to bed. He was back at the West 40 at 6 the next morning. The rain had stopped overnight, and the sky had cleared, and the May sun was already warming the dark surface of the beds when he drove down to check on his work. The rebuilt face of the slumped bed had held overnight. The drier material he had packed against it had set up in the cold, and was firm enough now that the morning sun would continue the work. He walked all 12 beds, looking at each one, checking the slopes and the channel depths and the way the surface was drying in the early morning light. The dark mud was already showing the lighter color that meant the surface was beginning to crust, which was the first sign that it was approaching the workable stage. He went back to the farmhouse for breakfast and came back to the field with coffee in a thermos and the soil report from Iowa State in his shirt pocket, folded to the technician's note at the bottom. He unfolded it and read the note again, standing at the edge of the West 40 in the May morning. Excellent alluvial deposit comparable to prime river delta soils. He folded it back up and put it in his pocket and went to work. The beds took 2 more weeks to reach the condition Corbett needed. He let them dry in the May sun, coming down every day to assess the surface consistency, waiting for the dark mud to lighten toward brown and the surface to develop the firm, slightly granular texture that told him the alluvial silt had set up properly. He broke the surface crust with a garden rake when it formed too thick, working it into the looser material below to improve the drainage and aeration. The surface of the beds was not like any soil he had worked before. It had a fineness and a uniformity that the upland ground mixed and churned and structured by decades of tillage and weather did not have. The alluvial deposit was the finest fraction of everything the river had carried, the particles too small and light to be dropped anywhere but the slowest, shallowest water, which was exactly where Corbett's West 40 sat, in relation to the Cedar River's flood pattern. The river's hydraulics had sorted the soil for him, selecting the finest, most fertile fraction, and delivering it to the lowest, most accessible part of his farm. His father had known this. August had known it in the way that farmers know things through observation rather than explanation, through the evidence of color and smell and texture recorded in a 5-cent notebook over 42 springs. He had not known the science. He had known the fact. The river takes, but the river gives. By the first week of June, the beds were ready. Corbett stood at the east end of the first bed and looked down its length 100 feet of dark, firm, rich soil raised 3 feet above the surrounding field shaped by his farm all and his father's arithmetic waiting for something to grow in it. He had never had soil like this to plant in. The upland ground was good Iowa ground, but it was tired in the way that farmed ground gets tired when it grows the same crops in the same rotation year after year. It had history in it, the history of 100 years of cultivation and harvest. The alluvial beds had no history. They were new soil. They had been on a river bank in Minnesota or Wisconsin 6 months ago, carried south by the Cedar River, deposited on Corbett's West 40 by a flood that every other farmer in the county considered a catastrophe. He went back to the farmhouse and got his seed boxes. What happened next is what this whole story is about. But to understand what happened next, you need to understand what Corbett Dren was risking. He had spent 2 weeks of May building 12 raised beds on the only bottom land he owned, using equipment, time, and his own labor that could have been spent on the upland crop bedding on a principle his father had articulated in 6 words without ever proving. He had the soil report from Iowa State. He had his father's 42 years of records. He had the smell of the mud in his hands that April morning, the smell that told him something was alive in that dark deposit that was not alive in the upland fields. What he did not have was proof. Proof was what the growing season of 1973 was going to provide. And as Corbett walked back to his first bed with his seed boxes and his planting tools on a warm morning in early June, the West 40 spread around him in its new configuration, 12 dark mounds rising from the field like something that had not been there before and would not be going away, the Cedar River running low and clear in its banks a quarter-mile to the west, having done what it had done every April for 100 years, and retreated to its channel to wait for the next spring. The river had given. Now Corbett Dren was going to find out what it had given him. Corbett planted the first bed on a Tuesday morning in early June, working from one end to the other with the methodical attention of a man who understands that what he does in the next hour will determine what he harvests in August. He had spent the previous evening sorting through his seed boxes at the kitchen table, separating what he would transplant from what he would direct seed-making decisions based not on habit but on what he knew about warm-season vegetables and what the alluvial soil appeared capable of supporting. The transplants went in first. Tomatoes and peppers and cantaloupe that Norma had started in the kitchen window back in March. Small plants in coffee cans and paper cups that had been growing under the south-facing glass since before the last frost hardened off on the porch steps over the previous 2 weeks until they were ready for open ground. He set the transplants in the bed centers at 18-inch spacing deeper than the books recommended because the alluvial soil was loose and fine enough that the roots would find their way without resistance, and the extra depth would give the stems a broader anchor. Then he direct-seeded sweet corn and cucumbers and green beans along the bed edges, pressing each seed into the dark soil with his thumb covering it, moving on. The work took most of the morning. When he was done, he stood at the end of the first bed and looked at what he had planted. The transplants were still small, showing the slight wilt that transplants always show in the first hours after they leave protected ground and meet open air and direct sun for the first time. The seeded rows were invisible, nothing but closed soil with seeds below it that might or might not germinate at the rate he needed. He had no way of knowing yet whether any of it would work. He went home for dinner and came back in the afternoon and planted the second bed. Let me tell you what happened in the weeks that followed, because the soil did something that Corbett had not fully anticipated, and the thing it did changed the way he understood everything his father had recorded in that composition book. The alluvial beds warmed faster than the upland ground. This was not something Corbett had planned for. It was not something the soil report had predicted. It was something he noticed on the third morning after planting, when he walked the beds in the early light before the dew had burned off and felt the difference under his boots. The bed surfaces were measurably warmer than the surrounding field by mid-morning, not dramatically warmer, but perceptibly warmer. The kind of difference you feel in the soles of your feet when you have been walking the same ground for 20 years, and you know what it is supposed to feel like. The dark color was the reason. Nearly black, loaded with organic matter, the alluvial surface absorbed heat from the June sun the way a dark cloth absorbs heat, converting light to warmth faster than the lighter colored upland soil could manage. By 10 in the morning, the bed surfaces were holding a temperature that the surrounding ground would not reach until early afternoon. The seeds in the bed edges germinated 3 days ahead of the same variety he had direct seeded in his upland garden. The transplants in the bed centers established 4 days faster than the same plants he had set out in the upland rows at the same time. He had a 2-week head start on his upland production, not because he had planted earlier, but because the soil was doing something that ordinary Iowa ground does not do. The alluvial soil was in a hurry. It was as if the fertility in that deposit had been building for years upstream, accumulating in the river system, concentrating in transit. And now that it had been given a place to express itself, it was going to do so with everything it had. The plants in the raised beds grew with a vigor that Corbett had not seen in 30 years of farming the same ground. The sweet corn pushed through the soil surface 6 days after planting and was 2 inches tall by the end of the first week. The cucumber seedlings emerged with both seed leaves already fully expanded, thick and dark green, in a way that seedlings in less fertile soil are not. He walked the beds every morning the way he walked his cattle every morning, checking for problems, assessing progress, letting the accumulated information of daily observation build into an understanding of what was happening in the soil below. What he found each morning was more growth than he expected, more color in the foliage, more reach in the root systems when he gently disturbed the soil at the edge of a bed to see what was happening below the surface. He said nothing about this to anyone for the first 3 weeks. There was nothing to say yet. Plants in the ground were not evidence of anything except that planting had occurred. Evidence would come in July and August when the crops produced or did not produce. Until then, the beds were a private experiment between Corbett Dren and his father's understanding of a river. He kept farming the upland acres in parallel the way he always had, planting corn in the rows he had laid out in April, cultivating the emerged rows in early June, doing the upland work alongside the bottomland work, the way a man manages 2 different operations on the same farm. The upland corn was doing what upland corn in Bremer County always did, germinating reliably, establishing at the expected pace, showing the steady, unremarkable growth of a crop that knows its soil and its season. The beds were showing something else. By the 4th week of June, the sweet corn on the raised beds was 2 inches taller than the same variety on the upland. Not dramatically taller, not impossibly taller, but consistently taller across all the beds in all the rows without exception. The stalks were thicker at the base. The leaves were a darker green, the kind of dark that means the plant has everything it needs and is spending all its energy on growth rather than searching for what it lacks. Corbett measured. He had a 6-foot folding rule that he had been carrying in his back pocket since his first year farming, and he used it the way his father had used it matter-of-factly as a way of converting what he saw with his eyes into numbers he could record. The upland corn measured 31 inches at the end of the 4th week of June. The bed corn measured 33 inches, 2 inches difference. He wrote it in his own notebook, not the composition book, but a new one he had started in May when he began the bed construction, recording dimensions and observations the way his father had recorded flood depths and mud colors. 42 years of August's entries had produced the foundation for what Corbett was building. He did not know yet how many years his own entries might produce. The tomato plants were the first thing that made him stop in his tracks. By mid-July, the transplants he had set in the bed centers were chest high and still pushing upward. He had staked them in late June with the 6-foot stakes he kept in the equipment shed, and by the 2nd week of July the plants had reached the tops of the stakes and were still growing. He added a second tier of twine between the stakes to support the lateral branches, which were now so heavy with developing fruit that they pulled sideways under their own weight. He counted the fruit set on one plant in bed number 4 on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-July. He started at the bottom of the plant and worked his way up, touching each cluster, counting each fruit, working slowly, because the plant was so densely loaded that it was easy to lose count. When he finished, he had 63 tomatoes on a single plant. They ranged from golf ball size near the bottom where the earliest fruit had set to small marbles near the top where the most recent blossoms had just finished setting. He walked to his upland garden and counted the fruit on the best tomato plant there. The same variety planted the same day, grown in soil that had produced good tomatoes for 20 years. 28 fruit. He counted twice to be sure. 63 on the bed plant. 28 on the upland plant. He stood in his upland garden for a while with that comparison in his head. He was not thinking about Weston Grawl. He was not thinking about the co-op or the Saturday morning laughter or any of the external circumstances that surrounded what he was doing on the West 40. He was thinking about a quiet man who had farmed the same 120 acres for 30 years and watched the same river flood the same field every April, and had understood something about what the river was doing that nobody else had bothered to understand. The river takes, but the river gives. He went back to the beds and kept working. The cucumbers were by any honest assessment out of control. They grew so fast that Corbett had to pick every second day to prevent the fruit from becoming oversized and bitter. A cucumber left on the vine for 4 days on the alluvial beds went from the ideal picking size to something thick and yellow and seedy that no one wanted to eat. He picked twice a week in the early mornings, filling the bushel baskets he brought down from the barn, loading them into the truck bed, driving back to the house where Norma met him at the tailgate. Norma had started making pickles in the 3rd week of July and had not stopped. She worked through the cucumber surplus the way a person works through a problem that is larger than expected but not without solutions, methodically and without complaint. Processing quarts of pickles in the kitchen in the evenings after supper while Corbett sat at the table with his notebook writing down the day's observations. 42 quarts of pickles by the end of July. Enough for the family through the winter, enough to give to the neighbors, enough to donate to the church Christmas bazaar in December. All from cucumbers that had grown in mud that every farmer in Bremer County was shoveling into the ditch 2 months earlier. The cantaloupes revealed themselves in August. Corbett had grown cantaloupe in his upland garden for 20 years. He knew what he expected from cantaloupe. 5 to 6 pound melons with decent flavor, the kind of melon that was good enough to eat with pleasure but not remarkable enough to remember. The upland soil produced reliable cantaloupe the same as it produced reliable corn and reliable tomatoes and reliable everything. It was ground that did what it was supposed to do without exceeding expectations. The alluvial bed cantaloupes exceeded expectations by a margin that Corbett found difficult to explain with the vocabulary he had available. The first melon he cut in early August weighed 8¼ pounds on the kitchen scale. The flesh was deep orange, deeper than any cantaloupe he had grown before, the color extending all the way to within a quarter-inch of the rind, rather than fading to pale yellow in the center the way ordinary cantaloupe does. He put a piece in his mouth and stood at the kitchen counter and tasted it. He had never tasted a cantaloupe like that. Not from his garden, not from the store, not from the farmer's market in Waverley, where he had bought melons occasionally over the years. The sweetness was not the mild, pleasant sweetness of an ordinary cantaloupe. It was intense in the way that fruit is intense when the soil has given it everything it needs, and the sun has done its full work. He called Norma into the kitchen. She tasted it and set down the piece she was holding and picked up another piece and tasted that one. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Where did this come from?" "Bed number 3, Corbett said. She nodded slowly. "That is not a normal melon." "No," Corbett said, "it is not." The mineral content of the alluvial soil was the reason, though Corbett did not know the technical explanation at the time. He knew the result. The high potassium levels that the soil report had documented, 50% higher than the upland average, drove sugar production in the fruit. The high organic matter made that potassium available to the plant roots in the form they could use most efficiently. The result was visible and edible and unmistakable. He loaded the truck with produce on the first Saturday in July and drove to the Waverley Farmers Market. He set up a table with a hand-lettered sign that Norma had painted on a piece of board the previous evening. She had made a practical decision about the sign without consulting Corbett, and without asking his opinion, because she understood something that he who thought about soil and water and plant growth did not think about as naturally. The sign said Corbett's Bottomland, flood-grown produce. Corbett had watched her paint it the night before without commenting. He had understood what she was doing when he saw the words flood-grown, understood that she was taking the thing everyone called a disaster and putting it on the front of the sign, making it the first thing a customer read, the first piece of information that shaped how they thought about what they were buying. He understood it and said nothing because it was right and there was nothing to add. The word flood was the story. The people of Waverley had watched the Cedar River flood every spring of their lives. They had watched the bottomland farmers deal with it, had heard the annual reports at the co-op about how many inches this year, and whose fields were under and who was going to lose what to the late planting. Flood was a word they knew. Flood was a word they had feelings about. And flood-grown produce sitting on a table at the farmer's market with tomatoes the size of baseballs and cantaloupes that smelled sweet from 3 feet away was something they wanted to understand. The table sold out by 9:30 on the first Saturday. Corbett had not planned for that. He had loaded the truck with what seemed like a reasonable quantity, several bushels of tomatoes, a basket of cucumbers, half a dozen cantaloupes, a couple dozen ears of sweet corn. He had expected to sell through the morning and drive home with a partial load remaining the way market days usually worked. Instead, he was loading his empty baskets back into the truck by 9:30 with money in his pocket and customers asking when he would be back. He came back the following Saturday with twice as much produce. He sold out by 9:15. The third Saturday, a woman approached his table before he had finished setting up and asked if she could buy 20 pounds of tomatoes for a restaurant in Cedar Falls. She was 18 miles away. She had heard about his tomatoes from a customer who had been at the market the previous week and had called the restaurant to describe them. She pulled cash from her purse without asking the price. Corbett named a price and she paid it without negotiating. He drove home with an empty truck and a full cash box and sat at the kitchen table with Norma and counted the money. $3,200 from less than 1 acre of planted surface by the end of the season. His 80 acres of upland corn, farmed the way he had always farmed them, had netted approximately $4,800 in a reasonable year. The beds on flood mud that every farmer in the county was throwing away on ground that Weston Grawl had called a riverbed that could not be farmed had generated 67% of his corn income from 1.25% of his acreage. He wrote the numbers in his notebook and looked at them for a long time. The comparison was not entirely fair because vegetable production requires more labor per acre than row crop farming, and the labor cost was not separated out in what Corbett had calculated. But the economics were clear enough that the accounting details did not change the fundamental truth. His father had been right. The river gave. And what it gave when you figured out how to keep it instead of shoveling it into the ditch was worth keeping. Now let me tell you about the spring of 1974 because the beds had survived one growing season, but they had not yet survived a flood. And until they survived a flood, they were an experiment. After they survived a flood, they would be something else. April of 1974 brought a bigger flood than 1973. The snowpack in northern Iowa and southern Minnesota had been heavier than average through the winter, and the March thaw had come later than usual, and then arrived all at once, pushing a larger than normal pulse of snowmelt into the Cedar River system. The rainfall in early April added to what was already running. By the second week of April, the Cedar River at Waverly was running at levels the gauge had not recorded in years. On the West 40, the water topped the field banks on April 11th and spread across the bottomland in the way that Cedar River water always spread, a slow brown advance that covered the low spots first and then crept outward as the river continued to rise. By April 13th, the water was 22 inches deep in the channels between the beds. 22 inches. August's records showed that the worst flood in 42 years of observation had reached 32 inches. Corbett had built the beds to 3 feet 36 inches to provide 4 inches of margin above that worst-case level. The flood of 1974 was reaching 22 inches in the channels between the beds, which meant the bed surfaces were sitting 14 inches above the waterline. Corbett stood on the field edge and watched. His neighbors were watching too from their own properties and from the county road that ran along the east side of the bottomland. Several of them had come down to the road to observe the flood. The way people observe floods that are larger than the usual, the way a community takes note when a river reminds it of what a river is capable of. Harlan Foss was there standing by his truck on the road looking at the West 40. What Harlan saw and what the other farmers along the road saw was something that the West 40 had never shown before in any of their lifetimes. The 12 raised beds were above the water. Not dramatically above, not safely above in the way that would have made anyone comfortable, but above. 3 feet of mud pushed up by a farmall tractor shaped by a blade dried and planted and harvested the previous summer. and now sitting above the flood line while the Cedar River spread across the surrounding field. The water moved through the channels between the beds and around the bed ends, flowing freely, the way water flows when it has room to move, depositing its silt load as it slowed in the low areas, and retreating as the river crested and began to fall. The beds stood above it like 12 dark islands in a brown field. Corbett watched the flood for 2 days, coming down to the field edge morning and afternoon, recording the water depth in the channels at each visit in his notebook, watching the level inch upward, and then hold, and then begin its slow retreat. He watched debris come through on the current, the corn stalks and branches and fence wire that a flooding river carries, and he watched it move between the beds and through the channels without accumulating against anything solid enough to dam it. He had not built solid faces into the channel sides. The bed slopes were gradual angled at the natural angle of repose for the alluvial silt, which allowed the water to move over the lower portions of the bed edges without creating the turbulence that would erode them. The beds were not fighting the flood. They were in conversation with it, offering no sharp angles or solid faces for the water to push against, accepting the flood into the channels and guiding it out the other end. On the third day the water began to drop. It dropped faster than it had risen, the Cedar River returning to its channel the way it always returned when the upstream pulse had passed, leaving behind the evidence of its visit in a layer of silt deposited wherever the water had slowed enough to release what it was carrying. Corbett walked out onto the West 40 when the channels were clear enough to navigate. He looked at the bed surfaces first. The tops of the beds showed the slight darkening in surface ceiling that meant flood water had splashed onto them at moments during the high water, but the surfaces had not been submerged. They were wet at the edges and dry toward the centers. The transplant residue from the previous year's crop was still in place, the dried tomato stakes and the cucumber vines he had not yet cleared from the fall harvest. He looked at the channels. The channels between the beds had collected fresh alluvial silt. 4 to 6 inches of new deposit, dark and heavy and fine-grained, the same quality of material that had started everything the previous spring. The flood had deposited it in the exact locations where Corbett needed it in the channels from which he could shovel it onto the bed surfaces, adding fertility and height to the growing medium without any transportation cost and without any application equipment. He stood in the channel between beds 7 and 8 with his boots sinking slowly into the new deposit and looked at what the river had left him. The beds had not lost soil in the flood. They had gained it. He knelt down in the channel and picked up a handful of the new deposit. He brought it to his face and smelled it, the same gesture he had made in this same field 12 months earlier when everything was just beginning. The smell was the same. Rich, deep, organic. The smell of fertility in transit settled now into the channels of a field that had been designed by his father's arithmetic and coded in 42 years of flood records to receive it. He thought about what this meant. Each flood was not a disruption of the bed system. Each flood was a maintenance event. The river came every spring and deposited new material in the channels, and that material was the raw ingredient for extending the beds, for raising the surfaces higher, as each season added another layer for improving the fertility of the growing medium without any external input. The system was not static, it was dynamic. It improved with each flood rather than degrading with each flood. His father had said the river takes, but the river gives. Corbett understood now that this was not a general observation about the nature of things. It was a specific, precise description of a mechanism. The flood took the topsoil from other people's fields and delivered it to the bottomland. The bottomland farmer, who knew how to keep what was delivered, would receive that soil every year for as long as the river ran and the floods came. The farmer who shoveled it into the ditch and called it garbage was throwing away the most productive soil in Iowa. The beds did not just survive the flood of 1974, they ate it. He went back to the farmhouse and sat at the kitchen table and wrote in his notebook for a long time. He wrote about the flood depth and the channel deposit and the condition of the bed surfaces and the smell of the new alluvial silt, and what he understood now about how the system worked that he had not fully understood before. Then he opened August's composition book to the entries from April of 1951, the big flood, the worst one in the record. He read his father's entry for that year, April 1951. Water reached 32 inches on the West 40, stayed 14 days. Mud deposit afterward, the darkest and heaviest in memory. Richest smell of any year I have recorded. The river gave more than it took this year. The river gave more than it took. August had written that in 1951, 22 years before Corbett built the first bed. He had written it as an observation, as a notation in his faithful record of what the flood left behind without the mechanism to act on it. The richest deposit in memory, and August had scraped it into the ditch and planted late and called it a bad year, because that was what you did. Corbett put the composition book down and looked out the kitchen window at the West 40, where the flood was still receding from the channels, and the beds were standing above it in the April afternoon. He would not be scraping this deposit into the ditch. Now let me tell you about Weston Grawl in the summer of 1974, because the man who laughed at the mud was still driving past the West 40 every week on his way to a customer south of town. And what he saw on those drives was changing from something he could dismiss to something he could no longer comfortably look away from. In the summer of 1973, the beds had been new and the crops had been impressive, but Weston had not stopped. He had slowed, occasionally looked from the road, and driven on. It was easy to drive on in 1973 because the beds were still rough and lumpy, in the way of things that are new, and the produce on them, while vigorous, could be attributed by a dismissive eye to the novelty of new broken ground, which always produces well in its first year before the soil exhausts. In the summer of 1974, the beds had survived a flood, and come out of it with new silt in the channels, and were growing their second season, with no sign of the diminishment that should have followed a first-year novelty effect. The tomatoes were chest-high in mid-July. The corn was a foot taller than the same variety in the adjacent upland fields. The cantaloupes in bed number 3 were already showing the slight yellowing of the stem attachment that means the fruit is approaching ripeness, 6 weeks before the upland cantaloupes would show the same sign. Weston drove past 3 times in July and slowed each time and drove on each time. He drove past once in early August and stopped on the road for several minutes without getting out his truck, idling on the gravel before driving on. He said nothing to anyone at the co-op about what he had seen. He did not revise the opinion he had delivered there the previous spring. He simply stopped offering that opinion, which was a different kind of statement. Corbett saw the truck stopped on the road each time. He was in the beds when it happened working, and he did not stop working to observe the observation. He noted it and went on. In the 3rd week of August, Weston drove past again. This time he pulled off the road and stopped. He got out of the truck. For the first time since construction began the previous spring, Weston Grawl stepped off the road and onto the West 40. He did not come far. He stopped at the field edge, standing on the short grass where the road met the field not yet on the cultivated ground. He stood there looking at the beds, at the tomato plants, and the corn stalks and the cantaloupe vines spreading across the bed surfaces with the particular lushness that the alluvial soil produced. Corbett was picking tomatoes on bed number 7, the bed closest to the road. He had seen Weston pull over and get out. He continued picking. Weston looked at the plants for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "Those beds look good." Corbett picked a tomato and set it in the basket. "They are good," he said. "What did you gross this year?" Weston said. Corbett considered the question. There was no reason not to answer it. The numbers were real and they did not need embellishment. "About 6,000 from the beds," Corbett said. "Maybe 4,008 from the upland corn." Weston was quiet for a moment. He was doing the arithmetic that anyone would do, the comparison between two numbers that described two different approaches to the same farm. Less than 2 acres of raised bed surface was outgrossing 80 acres of upland corn. "That mud grows like that every year," Weston said. "Better every year," Corbett said. "Every flood adds more silt. The beds get richer. The corn on the upland gets the same tired soil year after year. The beds get a fresh deposit of the best soil in the watershed every April. The river does my fertilizing for free." Weston looked at the road and then at the beds and then at the road again. "Your father used to say something about the river," Weston said. Corbett set another tomato in the basket. "The river takes, but the river gives," he said. "He was right," Weston said. "He just never figured out how to keep what the river gives instead of throwing it away," Corbett said. Weston looked at the beds for another moment. Then he looked at Corbett. His face had the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not expect to arrive, who has taken a road he was certain led nowhere, and found that it led somewhere after all. "I told you it was mud," Weston said. Corbett did not look up from his picking. "It is mud," he said. "It is also the most productive soil in Bremer County. Both things are true, Weston. The question is which one you pay attention to." Weston stood at the field edge for another moment. Then he turned and walked back to his truck. He opened the door and paused with his hand on the frame. He turned back toward Corbett and gave a single small nod, the kind of nod that a man gives when he has acknowledged something that does not require more acknowledgment than that. Then he got in his truck and drove away. Corbett watched the truck pull back onto the county road and head south. He stood for a moment in the bed with his basket of tomatoes. Then he went back to picking. There was nothing triumphant about the moment. That was not the kind of man Corbett Dren was, and not the kind of moment the West 40 produced. It was simply the moment when the longest-standing external doubt about what he was doing resolved itself quietly and without ceremony, the way doubts tend to resolve when the evidence becomes too concrete to be dismissed by anyone looking honestly at it. He filled the basket and carried it to the truck and came back for another. The beds were still producing. The river was out there in its channel 6 months from its next delivery. The channels between the beds still held the new silt from the spring flood waiting to be shoveled onto the bed surfaces before the ground froze. There was work to do. Corbett Dren went back to work. The fall work of 1974 had a different quality to it than any fall Corbett Dren could remember in 20 years of farming the same ground. It was not that the work was easier. The work was the same work it had always been, the harvesting and the winterizing and the equipment maintenance and the soil preparation that a farmer does in the months between the last crop and the first frost. What was different was the feeling underneath the work, the particular quality of a man doing familiar things when the ground beneath those things has shifted. He spent 3 days in October shoveling the new alluvial silt from the channels between the beds onto the bed surfaces, adding an inch and a half of the richest soil in Bremer County to the growing medium that had already produced 63 tomatoes on a single plant and cantaloupes that a restaurant in Cedar Falls was paying premium prices for. He worked with a long-handled spade, moving from channel to channel, systematically turning the new deposit up onto the bed edges and spreading it with a rake, building the bed slightly higher with each year's addition, the way a delta builds itself slowly and persistently, one flood's deposit at a time. This was the part of the system that Corbett had not fully understood when he built the first 12 beds in the spring of 1973. He had understood the beds as a way to keep the alluvial soil from being washed back into the river. He had not understood until the flood of 1974 deposited fresh silt in the channels, and he stood in those channels and smelled the new material, that the system was not static but accumulative. Each flood added to what was there. Each year the beds became slightly richer, slightly higher, slightly more productive than they had been the year before. His father's 42 years of observation had given him the height calculation that made the beds possible. What the beds themselves were teaching him was something August had not lived long enough to figure out. The flood was not an interruption of the farming system. The flood was the farming system. The river was the farmer. Corbett was the man in between. He expanded in the spring of 1975. He had planned for 12 beds and had built 12 beds, but after 2 seasons of production and 2 successful flood cycles, the arithmetic of the expansion was straightforward. The material for new beds was already sitting in the channels deposited there for free by the Cedar River's April flood. The labor to move it was his own. The tools were the same tools that had built the original 12. He built 6 more beds in May of 1975, bringing the total to 18. He built them on the south end of the West 40, the area he had left unimproved the previous 2 years, using the accumulated channel silt and fresh flood deposit to shape them, the same way he had shaped the originals 3 feet high, 20 feet wide, 100 feet long, with the same 8-foot channels between them. The new beds went into production that summer alongside the originals, and the originals continued to produce at the level the first 2 seasons had established. Corbett's gross from the beds that year was $5,100. Norma had expanded the market operation in parallel with the bed expansion. She had started with the Saturday market in Waverly and the roadside stand on the county road, and by the end of the 1973 season, she had 3 restaurant accounts in Cedar Falls. By 1975, she had added the food cooperative in Iowa City 40 miles away, which had asked for her specifically after a co-op member who shopped the Waverly Market brought a Corbett's Bottomland cantaloupe back to Iowa City and described it to the buying committee in terms that persuaded them to make a buying trip. The food cooperative wanted consistency and volume, and they were willing to pay for it. Norma drove to Iowa City for the first meeting with their buying committee and came back with a standing order for tomatoes and cantaloupes and sweet corn through the season. She had brought samples which she had packed in a cardboard box with the produce wrapped in newspaper the way she wrapped the Christmas ornaments, and the buying committee had tasted the cantaloupe and the discussion about price had taken approximately 4 minutes. Norma kept her records in composition books. This was not a deliberate echo of August's practice. She had always kept records in composition books because they were inexpensive and durable and easy to store. But Corbett noticed it one evening when he was looking for his own notebook, and opened hers by mistake, and saw her handwriting on the ruled pages, the columns of dates and quantities and prices, and he thought about his father's entries in the same kind of book, and understood that the record-keeping was itself a kind of inheritance, the habit of writing things down so that the knowledge of one generation could inform the next. The revenue numbers in Norma's books climbed year by year as the beds expanded and the markets deepened. 3,200 in 1973. 4,100 in 1974, 5,100 in 1975, 6,000 in 1976, the year the beds reached 24, and Weston Grawl stood at the field edge and did the arithmetic in his head and gave the small nod before driving away. The upland corn in the same years was producing in the range of $4,000 to $5,000, depending on the season and the price. The beds were not replacing the corn income, but augmenting it, adding a productive dimension to the farm that had not existed before, and that grew more productive with each passing year, while the upland soil stayed roughly constant in its yield potential. By 1980, Corbett Dren was farming 30 beds on the West 40 and producing an income from that 40 acres that would have seemed impossible to any of the farmers who had been at the co-op in April of 1973 when Weston Grail announced that Corbett was going to build sandcastles and plant tomatoes on river garbage. The river garbage was by 1980 the most economically productive ground in Bremer County per acre. This was not something Corbett announced. He did not go to the co-op and present numbers. He did not seek recognition from the people who had laughed. He simply farmed and kept his records and let the beds speak for themselves to anyone who drove past on the county road and looked at what was growing. Some of his neighbors looked. Some of them asked questions. Harlan Foss drove past the West 40 regularly as neighbors do and had watched the bed system expand from the original 12 to the 24 he could see in 1976, and then to the 30 that spread across the West 40 by 1980. He had left his own bottomland fallow since 1971 and had not regretted it. But watching Corbett's beds produce year after year had given him a particular kind of quiet, the quiet of a man who has made a decision and knows he cannot unmake it and has to find a way to be at peace with that. He stopped at Corbett's farm one evening in the fall of 1977. Corbett was in the barn when Harlan pulled up, and they stood in the barn doorway in the early dark and talked the way neighbors talk about weather and prices and the usual exchange of county information. After a while, Harlan said, "Your beds did well again this year." "They did," Corbett said. Harlan was quiet for a moment. "I think about my bottom sometimes," he said. "The ground I walked away from." Corbett looked out toward the West 40. He did not say anything. "I think about what you did and whether I could have done it," Harlan said. "Back in the beginning." "You still have the ground," Corbett said. Harlan nodded. "It still floods every spring." "It will always flood," Corbett said. "That is the point." Harlan looked at him. He understood what Corbett meant. The flood was not a problem to be solved. It was a resource to be managed. Walking away from ground because it flooded was like walking away from a well because the water came out wet. I might try a few beds, Harlan said. On the lowest section, Corbett told him what he knew. He spent an hour in the barn doorway telling Harlan what he had learned in 4 years of bed construction and flood management, the calculation of height from flood records, the importance of channel spacing, the way the bed surfaces should be prepared before planting, the timing of the alluvial silt addition in the fall. He did not hold anything back, and he did not charge for the knowledge. It was not his knowledge in the first place. It was his father's, and August had gotten it from the river, and the river was not charging anyone. In the spring of 1978, Harlan Foss built 8 raised beds on the lowest section of his bottomland. They were not as well positioned as Corbett's because Harlan did not have 42 years of flood records to work from, only the notes Corbett had shared about his own property and the general principle of building above the worst known flood level. Harlan's beds were at the right height but in a slightly less favorable hydraulic position, which meant the alluvial deposit in his channels was less consistent than what Corbett received. They produced nevertheless. Harlan sold tomatoes at the Waverly Market that summer, one table over from Corbett's table with a sign that said Foss Bottom Land Produce. Norma looked at the sign and looked at Corbett and did not say anything, which was her way of saying she approved. The knowledge spread the way. Knowledge spreads in farm communities from farm to farm through the practical channels of neighbor talking to neighbor, slowly at first, and then more broadly as the results became visible and undeniable. By 1982, 4 families in the western part of Bremer County were farming raised beds in the Cedar River bottomland. None of them had beds as extensive or as productive as Corbett's, because none of them had started with August's 42 years of flood records, and none of them had his 12 years of accumulated bed building experience. But all of them were producing vegetables in ground that the county had written off as unfarmable, and all of them were making money doing it. Now let me tell you about a woman named Patricia Soule because she is part of this story even though she never met Corbett Dren until 1991. Patricia was a graduate student in the agronomy department at Iowa State University, working on her doctoral thesis in 1990 and 1991. Her area of study was what the university called alternative soil management systems in flood-prone agricultural areas, which was the academic way of describing what farmers like Corbett and Harlan had been doing in the Cedar River bottoms for nearly 20 years. Her thesis advisor had heard about the Bremer County beds from a county extension agent who had been trying to write a report about them for 3 years and had not been able to get enough information to justify the report because the farmers involved were not interested in filling out forms. Patricia drove to Waverly in the spring of 1991 and asked around until someone directed her to the Dren farm on the county road west of town. Corbett was 65 years old when Patricia Soule appeared in his driveway. He had been farming the West 40 in its current configuration for 18 years. The beds had grown to 36 over that time, covering the entire 40 acres in the systematic arrangement he had worked out in the early years, with channels that the river filled each spring and surfaces that grew more fertile with each annual deposit. The system had survived 18 floods, including 3 that exceeded his father's record of 32 inches, in which cases Corbett had simply accepted the slight overtopping of the bed edges and waited for the water to recede and the beds to drain. which they did within 2 or 3 days of the river returning to its channel, because the alluvial silt, for all its density, when wet, drained quickly once the flood pressure was removed. 18 years. Not one flood had destroyed a bed. Patricia brought a soil testing kit and notebooks and a camera, and she spent 3 days on the West 40 taking samples and measurements and photographs and asking questions. Corbett answered her questions the way he answered all questions about the beds, plainly and without embellishment, stating what he had observed and done without claiming more than he knew. She asked him how he had figured out the system. He told her about the April morning in 1973 when he knelt in the flood mud and smelled it. He told her about August's composition book and the 42 years of flood records. He told her about the soil report from Iowa State and the numbers that had confirmed what the smell had suggested. He told her about building the first 12 beds from flood mud using a farmall and a rear-mounted blade. He told her about the 1974 flood and the moment he understood that the channels were designed by the river to receive silt and that the beds were not fighting the flood, but accepting it. Patricia was writing as fast as she could write. "How did you know the height to build them?" she asked. "My father kept flood records for 42 years, Corbett said. Average flood was 17 inches. The worst he ever recorded was 32. I built to 3 feet, 4 inches of margin above the worst he saw." She looked up from her notebook. "Your father kept flood records." "In a composition book," Corbett said. "From 1932 to 1965. Every year the date the water arrived, the date it left the maximum depth, and a description of the mud it deposited." She was quiet for a moment. "Did he build beds?" "No," Corbett said. "He just watched." She wrote something in her notebook and looked at it. "He watched for 42 years and you built for 18 years, she said. 60 years of observation in the same field." Corbett had not thought about it in those terms before. He looked at the beds stretching across the West 40, the 36 dark mounds of accumulated alluvial fertility, the channels between them that the river filled each spring, and that he emptied each fall onto the bed surfaces. "That is right," he said. 60 years. Patricia's thesis, completed and defended in the spring of 1992, was titled "Alluvial Raised Bed Agriculture as a Flood Adaptation Strategy in the Cedar River Bottomland," and it documented in the formal language of soil science and agricultural research what Corbett had proven empirically in 18 years of farming. The beds produced yields 4 to 6 times higher per acre than conventional upland fields in the same county. They required zero purchased fertilizer, the alluvial deposits providing all the nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium the crops needed. They were self-renewing through the annual flood deposits, with each flood adding fertility rather than removing it. And they converted a perennial agricultural liability, the spring flooding that had driven farmers off the Cedar River bottomland for generations, into the farm's primary competitive advantage. The thesis was read by people in the agronomy department and by people in the extension service and by a few people in the wider world of sustainable agriculture research who found in Corbett Dren's West 40 a demonstration of something they had been theorizing about in papers and conferences for years: the floodplain as resource, the river as partner, the farmer as the man who figured out how to receive what the river was giving instead of fighting what it could not be stopped from doing. Corbett read the thesis when Patricia sent him a copy. He read it at the kitchen table over 3 evenings following her analysis of the soil samples she had taken, reading her interpretation of the data he had been generating for 18 years without the scientific vocabulary to describe it. She named things he had known by feel. She quantified processes he had understood by observation. She placed what he had done in the context of agricultural history, connecting it to the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta, and the market gardens of the Nile floodplain, and the corn production of the Mississippi bottomland, all the places in the world where people had learned to farm with a river rather than against it. He found the comparison instructive. He had not known about the Mekong Delta when he built the first bed in 1973. He had not known about the alluvial agriculture of ancient Egypt. He had known about his father's composition book and the smell of black mud in his hands on an April morning in Bremer County, Iowa, and that had been enough. He closed the thesis and set it on the kitchen table next to August's composition book, where it stayed for several days while Corbett went about his work, the two documents sitting side by side, the 42 years of a father's observation and the scientific analysis of a daughter's interpretation of a son's application of that observation. In 1995, Corbett was 69 years old and had been farming the same ground for 30 years. Ned was in his mid-30s and had been working the farm alongside his father since he was old enough to drive a tractor. And the transition of responsibility had been happening gradually, in the way that farm transitions happen when they happen well through proximity and shared work rather than formal handover. Corbett did not make a speech about the transition. He did not call Ned into the kitchen and tell him it was time. He simply began doing less and watching more, the way a man does when he has taught a thing by doing it for 30 years, and the teaching is finished, and what remains is the watching to confirm that what was taught took hold. He took Ned to the beds on a morning in October after the fall shoveling was done, when the new alluvial silt had been turned up from the channels onto the bed surfaces and the beds were dressed for winter, and he stood at the end of bed number 1, the first bed he had ever built, and looked down its length. The bed had been producing for 22 years. It was 3 inches higher than it had been when he built it in 1973, built up by 22 annual additions of alluvial silt, each one adding to the depth and fertility of the growing medium. The soil on the surface of bed number 1 in 1995 was not the same soil he had shaped into a mound in May of 1973. It was 22 layers of river deposit on top of that original mound, each layer added by the Cedar River and redistributed by Corbett's shovel, each layer contributing its fraction to the accumulated fertility of what was now the most productive piece of ground in Bremer County. Before you look at the crop, Corbett said to Ned, look at what the river left. Come down to the channels after the flood recedes and look at what is in there. That is your soil report for the year. What the river leaves in the channels tells you what the beds will produce that season. Dark and heavy and rich smelling means a good deposit year. Light and sandy means the river ran fast and dropped its coarse material before it got here. You read the channels the way your great-grandfather read the channels, which is to say you read them the way a farmer reads anything, by looking and smelling and feeling and writing down what you find. He paused. Your great-grandfather kept a composition book for 42 years and called it a flood record. It was actually a soil record. He was recording the quality of what the river delivered each spring. Without knowing that was what he was doing. When you add your entries to his entries and my entries, you will have one continuous record of this river and this field going back to 1932. That record is worth more than anything else on this farm except the beds themselves. Ned looked at the bed and then at his father. He did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would add to what had just been said. He understood it the way a son understands something his father tells him when the father is telling it for the last time, not as information, but as inheritance. He took the farm the way farms are taken by being there when it needed someone to be there, by knowing what needed to be done before it was asked, by carrying the habits of observation and record keeping that his father had demonstrated and his grandfather had established in a 5-cent composition book during the worst decade American farming had ever seen. Corbett Dren died in April of 2008, which was the month the Cedar River flooded. He was 82 years old and he had farmed 120 acres in the western part of Bremer County for 43 years, and the river had flooded the west 40 every single one of those years. And every single one of those years, he had been ready for it. And every single one of those years the channels had received what the river delivered, and the beds had stood above what the river brought. He died in the farmhouse in the bedroom where he had slept since he was a boy, and where he had read his father's composition book for the first time, and where he had lain awake on more nights than he could count thinking about soil and water and the relationship between a river and the land it runs through. He died without owing anything to anyone and without a single April flood on the West 40 having ever reached the top of the beds he had built from his father's arithmetic. The funeral was at the Lutheran Church in Waverly, the same church where August and his wife had been members for 30 years, and where Corbett had attended every Sunday of his childhood. The building was full. The farmers of Bremer County had known Corbett Dren as a neighbor for 4 decades, and whatever they had thought of his plans when he announced them at the co-op in 1973, they had watched what happened afterward for 35 years, and the watching had settled the question of what those plans had been worth. Ned spoke at the service. He was not a man given to long speeches, and he did not give one. He stood at the front of the church with a mason jar in his hand and looked at the people in the pews, and what he said was this: "My father built 12 raised beds from river mud in 1973. The equipment dealer called it a sandcastle. The neighbors called it a mess. The soil lab at Iowa State called it comparable to prime river delta soils. The Cedar River called it a gift and delivered a fresh layer every spring for 35 years. He held up the mason jar. It was filled with alluvial silt from bed number 1, the first bed Corbett had ever built, still producing in its 35th year, with no sign of diminishing, the bed surface now 3 inches higher than the day it was shaped and 22 layers richer. "This is soil from bed number 1, Ned said. It has been building since 1973. 35 annual deposits of alluvial silt, each one adding to what was there before. Each one free. My father did not create this soil. The Cedar River created it. My father figured out how to keep it instead of throwing it away. He set the jar on the lectern. My grandfather said the river takes, but the river gives. My father heard that and built beds. I heard it from my father and kept building. My daughter Marin hears it from me. The saying passes down. The beds pass down. The river keeps giving." He sat down. That was the service. Now let me tell you about Marin Dren, because the river was still running, and the beds were still standing, and the story was not finished. Marin was Ned's daughter, born in 1984, which meant she was 24 years old in the spring of 2008 when her grandfather died and the Cedar River flooded the West 40 for the 36th time since the first beds were built. She had grown up on the farm the way farm children grow up, when the farm is the entire landscape of childhood, knowing every bed by its number, and knowing which ones produced the best tomatoes and which channel held the deepest silt deposit after each flood, and why bed number 1 was still the most productive bed on the West 35 years after it was built. She was in her third year of a soil science program at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa State, the same university whose extension soil lab had processed 3 samples of Cedar River alluvial silt in the spring of 1973 and returned a result that a technician had annotated with the words comparable to prime river delta soils. The same university where Patricia Soule had written her doctoral thesis in 1991 and 1992 using Corbett's West 40 as its primary case study. Marin did not know the technician who had processed her grandfather's samples. She had read Patricia's thesis in the university library in her second year, and had felt the particular sensation of reading about a place you know in the voice of someone who has analyzed it. She had grown up walking those beds. Patricia Soule had walked them once for 3 days in 1991. The thesis was thorough and accurate and well sourced, but it described the beds from the outside from the position of a researcher who had come to the West 40 as a subject of study. Marin knew the beds from the inside from the position of a child who had played in the channels and helped shovel alluvial silt on fall Saturdays and eaten cantaloupes warm from the vine on August afternoons. Her senior thesis, completed in the spring of the year after her grandfather died, was titled Alluvial Raised Bed Agriculture as a Flood Adaptation Strategy, a multi-generational case study with longitudinal soil analysis. She used the soil samples she had collected from all 36 beds over the course of 2 visits in the fall of 2008, comparing them against the Iowa State Extension Lab results from 1973 and the samples Patricia Soule had taken in 1991, building a 35-year longitudinal record of how the alluvial soil had changed over time as each year's flood deposit added to the cumulative fertility of the growing medium. The results were what anyone who had watched the beds produce year after year without purchased fertilizer would have predicted, which did not make them any less significant as documented science. The organic matter in bed number 1 had increased from the 7.2% recorded in 1973 to 11.4% in 2008. The nitrogen availability had increased proportionally. The soil structure had improved with each annual deposit, the fine alluvial particles binding together in the presence of the organic matter into aggregates that held moisture and drained excess water with the particular efficiency that the best agricultural soils have. The beds were not declining, they were improving. 35 years of floods had not degraded the raised bed system. 35 years of floods had built it into something more productive than it had been in its first year, more productive than it had been in its 10th year, more productive than the original alluvial deposit that Corbett had stood in on an April morning in 1973 and held in his hands and smelled and understood as something worth keeping. The opening paragraph of Marin's thesis read as follows. In 1973, my grandfather knelt in flood mud while every farmer around him was shoveling it into the ditch. He smelled it first. Then he built something with it. The beds he built from river mud in 1973 are still producing in 2008 their 35th year. This thesis documents why using longitudinal soil analysis and multi-generational field records spanning 60 years of observation on a single flood-prone field in Bremer County, Iowa. Her thesis advisor, a professor named Dr. Warren Kettlehut, who had 30 years of soil science research behind him and several published papers on alluvial soil dynamics, read the thesis over a weekend and found something in it that he had not found in most student work. He found a question that had been answered not by a researcher in a laboratory, but by a family in a field over multiple generations through the accumulated application of observation and patient work to a problem that the surrounding community had decided was not worth solving. He called Marin into his office. "Your grandfather built these beds from flood mud," he said. "Yes," Marin said, using his father's 42-year flood records to calculate the height. "That is right. And the beds have been producing for 35 years without purchased fertilizer." 35 years, she said. Dr. Kettlehut was quiet for a moment. He looked at the thesis on his desk and then at Marin. "Your grandfather did not have a soil science degree," he said. "He had a composition book," Marin said, "and a farmall tractor. And his father's saying about the river." "What was the saying?" Dr. Kettlehut asked. "The river takes, but the river gives." The professor looked at the thesis again. He read something on one of the pages. He looked up. "Does the family still farm the beds?" he said. "My father does," Marin said. "All 36 of them." Dr. Kettlehut nodded slowly. "I would like to see them," he said. He drove to Bremer County that summer with Marin, the same drive that Patricia Soule had made in 1991 down through the rolling country of central Iowa into the flatter land of the Cedar River Valley. Ned met them at the farm and walked them down to the West 40, and Dr. Kettlehut walked the beds the way all the scientists and engineers and agricultural professionals who had visited over the years had walked them slowly and with close attention, pausing at the channels to look at the residual alluvial deposit crouching at the bed edges, to feel the soil structure standing at intervals along the lengths of the beds, and looking down them the way you look down a well-built structure to assess its integrity. He did not say much while he was walking. He asked practical questions. How wide are the channels? What is the slope angle of the bed faces? How much material do you add from the channels each fall? How do you manage the timing of the planting relative to the last flood date? Ned answered the questions the way Corbett would have answered them, plainly and without embellishment, describing what he did and why he did it without claiming more knowledge than the practice justified. When they had walked all 36 beds and returned to the field edge, Dr. Kettlehut stood and looked back at the West 40. The beds stretched across the 40 acres in their systematic arrangement, the channels between them catching the late afternoon light, the bed surfaces dark with the accumulated fertility of 35 years of annual alluvial additions. He said what he had been thinking since he first read Marin's thesis. "Your grandfather understood something about floodplain agriculture that soil scientists have been trying to articulate in formal terms for decades. He arrived at it not through research, but through inheritance. His father recorded what the river delivered. He figured out how to receive it. That is a form of knowledge that universities are not good at producing, but that fields and families are very good at producing when the conditions are right." He paused. "The conditions here were right for 60 years. That is what this field represents. 60 years of a family paying attention to a river and figuring out what the river was trying to give them." Marin stood beside her father at the field edge and looked at the beds. The Cedar River was out there in its channel a quarter-mile to the west, running in the July heat at its lowest level of the year, waiting for the snowmelt and the spring rains that would send it over its banks again in April and fill the channels between the beds with another year's delivery. She went back to Iowa State and finished her thesis. She brought the bound copy home to the farm on a Saturday in May, the weekend after her graduation. Ned was in the barn when she arrived, doing what farmers do on Saturday mornings in May. She went to the farmhouse and set the thesis on the kitchen table and went to find him. When they came back inside, Ned's wife had set lunch on the table and the thesis was sitting where Marin had left it in the center of the table where the afternoon light from the south window fell across the cover. Ned looked at it. He sat down and turned it so he could read the cover, his daughter's name and her title and the date, and below those the university seal. He turned the book over and looked at the back. He set it back down on the table cover up. He looked at Marin across the table. Your great-grandfather would have read every word of this, he said. I know it, Marin said. Ned nodded. He looked at the window that faced south toward the west 40, though the beds were not visible from the house. He looked at the table. The composition book was still in the desk in the barn office. It had been there since 1965, since the morning Corbett had found it filed among the seed receipts and equipment manuals where August had kept it, not hidden just there, waiting for the moment when someone would read it and understand what it contained. Ned got up from the table and went to the barn and came back with the composition book and set it on the table beside Marin's thesis. The two books sat there in the afternoon light. One of them was a 5-cent composition book, black and white cover, the spine worn soft from handling the pages filled in August Dren's careful block letters with 42 years of flood records, the date the water arrived and the date it left, and the depth on the West 40 and the color and texture of the mud it deposited. The other was a bound thesis with a university seal on the cover, and 160 pages of soil analysis and field data and academic interpretation of 60 years of evidence from the same 40 acres, the same field, the same river, the same annual delivery of alluvial silt, recorded first by a man who knew what he was seeing but not what it meant, and then built by his son who knew what it meant and not yet what to call it, and then analyzed by his granddaughter who could name and measure and document what the family had known and practiced and handed down for 3 generations. Marin picked up August's composition book and opened it to the entry for April 1973, the year Corbett had built the first beds. April 1973. Water arrived April 8th. Receded April 19th, 11 days. Maximum depth 18 inches on the West 40. Mud very dark, heavy, rich smell. Best deposit in several years. August had died in 1965. The entry for 1973 was not his. It was in Corbett's handwriting, the same careful block letters that August had used the habit of observation and record passed from father to son, along with the composition book and the 40 acres, and the river that flooded them every spring. She read the 1973 entry to Ned, and he listened. Best deposit in several years, Ned said. The year your grandfather built the first beds. The river gave more than it took that year, Marin said. The river always gives more than it takes, Ned said. That is what your great-grandfather understood. That is what your grandfather proved. That is what you have documented. He looked at the 2 books on the table. The saying passes down, he said. The beds pass down. The river keeps giving. The Cedar River was out there in its channel in the May afternoon, running low and clear in the spring light, waiting for the year to turn toward winter and the snow to accumulate, and the spring melt to come again and send it over its banks and into the channels between 36 raised beds built from river mud by a man who knelt down in a flooded field in 1973 and smelled what the river was offering and understood it was worth keeping. The West 40 still floods every April. The water still rises in the channels between the beds and deposits its annual layer of alluvial silt in the exact places where it is needed, free of charge, without application equipment delivered by a river that has been making this delivery to this flood plain since before there were farms in Bremer County, since before there were counties, since before there were Europeans on this continent. The beds still stand above the water. They are 3 inches higher than they were in 1973, built up by 35 annual additions, each one darker and richer than the surrounding upland ground, each one a layer of evidence for what happens when a man pays attention to what a river is offering instead of fighting what it cannot be prevented from doing. Sometimes the thing everyone calls a disaster is actually a delivery. Sometimes the mud that floods your field is the best soil you will ever touch. And sometimes the man who kneels in the mud while everyone else stands on dry ground is the man who sees what dry ground never shows you. Corbett Dren farmed the flood. He built beds from river mud. He grew vegetables in what everyone called garbage. And for 35 years every April the Cedar River delivered another layer of proof. The co-op called it mud. Corbett called it a gift. The soil report called it comparable to prime river delta soils. They were all right. But Corbett was the only one who built something with it. His father told him the river gives. He spent 35 years finding out how much. The answer is in the beds. It is in the composition book in the desk in the barn. It is in the thesis on the kitchen table beside the composition book. It is in the channels between the beds every April when the Cedar River comes over its banks and drops what it has been carrying and retreats to wait for the next year. The river is still giving.